Right, so thank you all for coming along today. It's my pleasure to introduce Aditya Balasubramanian to present the first book talk for his new book, Toward Free Economy, Swatantra and Opposition Politics in Democratic India. Aditya is a lecturer in economic history at Australian National University, and he completed his PhD at Trinity College, Cambridge, as a British Marshall Scholar and a Cambridge Trust Scholar. His research for his PhD has become this book, but he's also engaged in various new research projects, including on India's botanical histories, he was just telling me, and the history of roads and road building. His PhD dissertation won the Ellen MacArthur Prize in Economic History and was shortlisted for the Prince Consort and Thirlwall Prize for Best Dissertation in the Faculty of History. And I'm also very pleased to have learned today and to be able to tell other colleagues at King's that Aditya will be back at King's as a visiting fellow at the Menzies Australia Institute in May and June this year. So this is our first of, I hope, several encounters. So very welcome to King's, Aditya. And congratulations on your forthcoming book. I thought also it might be fitting just to reflect on the fact that this is the third in a series of events we've hosted at the India Institute over the last week. And this feels like a very fitting answer in some ways to the Nehru Memorial Lecture, which we hosted on Friday, delivered by Madhavan Pallat, with the subject of Nehru's democratic dilemmas. And one of the dilemmas that Madhavan reflected on in that lecture was Nehru's concern about how India's opposition would take shape. And how the one-party dominant system that he presided over as Prime Minister would evolve. And Madhavan told us that Nehru viewed the Swatantra Party as certainly a reactionary force, but that he also welcomed its emergence as a sign of an emerging two-party system. So it feels very fitting at the end of a week of discussion about Nehru's democratic dilemmas to hear more about the Swatantra Party and the emergence or consolidation of opposition politics in democratic India. So having said that, over to you, Aditya.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and it's really a delight to be back at the King's India Institute, where I defended my dissertation actually in Sunil Kilnani's office in January 2019. So I suppose it's fitting that this is the first place that I speak about the book. It's really, really wonderful to be here. I want to say a special thanks to Luis for chairing, to Professor Nirda Jayal for inviting me to speak today, and to Vignesh for organizing the event. So the book is called Toward a Free Economy, Swatantra and Opposition Politics in Democratic India. What I'm going to do is to give you a little bit of a brief overview of the book, then kind of zero in on free economy, one kind of project of free economy, and then talk a little bit about one of the dimensions of opposition politics before kind of drawing to a close. But if there are things that, it's always an exercise in compression. So if there's anything that you think I should have talked about or you're extremely confused about, please feel free to ask in the Q&A. Thank you all for being here. So above all, the motivation behind this book is the question of how we can better understand India's simultaneous escape from colonial economic stagnation and the persistence of the democratic form, which was introduced to a largely poor and unlettered people. So for most of this period, as you all know, the umbrella Indian National Congress has been in power at the center in India's Westminster-style parliamentary system. From the 1950s, led by Jawaharlal Nehru, the Congress introduced planned economic policy that sought to consolidate a heavy industrial public sector and bring about what was called in the Avadi session of the Congress in 1955 a socialistic pattern of society. The legacy of the Nehruvian era loomed large. Indeed, for most of India's post-colonial history, a project of statist economic policy broadly construed associated with heavy industrial central planning reigned, or at least that paradigm. In contrast to this earlier era, the post-1991 period has been characterized by economic liberalization and private service sector-led growth, particularly in the last in the pre-2010 period. But accompanying this changing economic landscape, the right-wing Hindu nationalist politics of the BJP have come to dominate both center and key states in India's political system. Right? In the states, regional and caste-based parties have asserted themselves increasingly, again, talking broad strokes. And Congress has been reduced to a shadow of itself. This period has been characterized in social scientific literature as a sort of sharp break from the past. Right? But India was always a mixed economy of private and public sectors, with the majority of Indians engaged in private and informal sector activity. And so despite the dominance of the Congress, political opposition was given the space to emerge and advance alternate agendas. And please give us a useful anecdote from Professor Pallad's talk. Nehru famously said, though, that Swatantra was a ghost-like party stuck in the 19th century. And so part of the book's motivation is to challenge that. But it's from this observation of the prominence of private activity and the fact that opposition was vibrant during this period that the project begins. Well, broadly, Toward a Free Economy argues that during the 1950s and 1960s, a non-sectarian right-wing politics embracing an alternative economic paradigm to planning emerged in the form of the Swatantra or Freedom Party. This was a politics associated with the key word of free economy against the so-called socialist planned economy of the day. The emergence of free economy was driven by changes in Indian economy and society. Its major ideological constituencies hailed from landed and mercantile castes in southern and western India, several of which were transitioning to new forms of economic activities. I'm thinking especially of the Kammas and Reddys of Andhra, Tamil Brahmins and Gaundars of what was then Madras, the Parsis of Bombay, the Patidars of Gujarat. Free economy's progenitors were not formal economists. Rather, they were politicians and publicists who had derived an economic common sense shaped by their experiences of regional and Mufassil political economy. Their ideas, expressed in various genres, drew on the idioms of anticolonial nationalism and selectively interpreted transnational currents of economic thought. These ideas took on meanings that varied by region and language, caste and class, but four key characteristics united these varying visions: anti-communism, the advocacy of unfettered private economic activity, decentralized development, and the defense of private property. The Swatantra Party's project of opposition politics, or making effective opposition a reality, was one of imagination, communication, and mobilization. First, opposition politics meant presenting a conservative alternative to the Congress as salutary for the health of a postcolonial democracy with progressive ideals. Next, opposition politics meant bringing economic affairs into the domain of public consciousness and mobilizing people around these issues rather than the concerns of caste or religion. Third, opposition politics meant using the institutions of India's tripartite system of government to check the power of the ruling party. Opposition politics was an alternative to the dominant mode of influence sought by what were called parties of pressure at the time, who vied to influence the umbrella party of consensus by adjusting its center of gravity in the one-party dominant system theorized by Rajni Kothari. Swatantra sought no less than to lay the foundations for a two-party system and invigorate Indian democracy. What scholarly contributions does this book offer? First, it reveals that in the heyday of the Nehruvian state, there existed powerful and politically organized constituencies for alternative market-friendly policy, making a careful study of the regional and caste context in which this emerged. It thus moves us beyond the dominant thrust of postcolonial historiography on what is sometimes called the 3 Ps of planning, policy, and partition. Second, it shows how the Cold War battle of hearts and minds featured in an anti-communist Indian print culture underneath the surface of India's formal non-alignment and alongside the more popular left-leaning literature of the time. Third, moving beyond South Asia, this book rewrites the history of economic thought as a history of economic and political consciousness and communication rather than theory. And it consults an archive of print and visual culture extensively to do so. Thus, it moves beyond canonical thinkers and texts, borrowing methods from the social history of ideas. And finally, this book is also a contribution to the burgeoning historiography of neoliberalism. This fraught term has been used in a vast range of contexts, as everything from an epithet about everything that has gone wrong with the world since the 1980s, to a conspiracy theory about economists and their influence on society, to a neologism for capitalism. By contrast, the more sophisticated historical literature on neoliberalism has characterized it as an expert-driven anti-democratic project introduced to insulate markets from politics and to defend capitalism. My book deploys the terminology of neoliberalism here in a very narrow sense to refer to an ideological project associated with the Montpellier society of economists like Hayek and Friedman, Milton Friedman, that sought to introduce markets into various domains of economic and social life, and warned of the dangers of statism in the aftermath of World War II as a response to the dominant Keynesianism asserting itself over Western economies. My book shows how mid-20th century Indian economic conservatives established points of contact and selectively borrowed rhetoric from self-identifying neoliberals, even though they were not meaningfully neoliberal themselves, but as part of an explicitly democratic rather than anti-democratic project, although not a progressive one. The book raises a question about at what point an ideology becomes something else after it moves beyond its heartland, and whether or not that category continues to be valuable. I would say it raises the question, but doesn't give you an answer, so you can think for yourself. So to move to the next part of the talk, let's begin in Bombay in 1947, where a flour mill owner called Ranchor Das Lotwala rechristened his institute for Indian sociology as the Libertarian Social Institute. It was here that the term free economy was coined and discussed. And you can see the institute here, which today operates as the RL Foundation Library, and it's at the intersection of Vittalbhai and Vallabhbhai Patel Roads, which I think is significant. In Girgaon. Lotwala hailed from the Gujarati-speaking Halai Lohana caste, and on the image you can see here, the library, which you can visit today. There's actually a photo of the founder here, who seems like it's not the best day. So Lotwala's family had lived in Bombay for centuries. He converted his family flour trading shop, in Gujarati lot means flour, into a machine-operated flour mill, an example of the transition to new forms of economic activity highlighted in the book. Since World War I, he had been a patron of various anti-imperial and social causes. And indeed, I spent a lot of time on this book trying to account for how he moves from, and we can talk about later, the key patron of communism in India, somebody who helped sponsor the production of the first Indian edition of the Communist Manifesto, Dange's patron, etc., into something that's quite different from that. So Lotwala took part in journal editing and sponsorship with the profits from his mill and organized various discussion groups. Once India became free in 1947, he directed his attention toward the ideal system of political economy for the country. The history of how the keyword of free economy emerged in this institute and spread across India illuminates A, how anti-colonial idioms and institutional forms were repurposed in the post-colony as part of a conservative project, B, how an idiosyncratic mixture of transnational contacts and texts from overseas helped free economy take shape, and C, how anti-communism played a significant but hitherto unacknowledged role in shaping the trajectory of ideas and politics in Nehruvian India. So, as free economy moved beyond its original utopian conception, this discourse started to be connected to a critique of Indian political economy. Although it primarily circulated in India's English language print public sphere, the discourse also managed to reach more populous regional language publics and even deep into the Indian Mafasal. By the mid-1950s, it was yoked to the demand for opposition to the Congress and formed the basis for the Swatantra party. Free economy emerged against the backdrop of the Indian state's promulgation of the ideology and practices of planned economic policy, about which several have written, but most recently my friend Nikhil Menon. As you can see from the still of the government film Tomorrow is Ours, planning was seen as a vehicle of progress, right? You can see the wheels churning. It was accompanied by a rhetoric of socialism. India's expert-directed 5-year plans commenced in 1951, but built on policies initiated during World War II, as your former colleague Srinath Raghavan has shown in his book, India's War. They pursued a strategy of import substituting industrialization that privileged investment in heavy industrial activity led by the public sector. And they were financed by foreign aid from both superpowers, increased taxation, and inflation creating deficits. Planning led to the nationalization of select private enterprises and efforts to redistribute land to redress unequal ownership. Private industry was tightly controlled and commodities, tightly regulated, and commodities and currency exchange tightly controlled. The social foundations for free economy were laid by tensions that emerged between 3 interest groups growing in number and prominence: the bureaucracy, the professional class, and business people operating local and regional small and medium-sized firms. The bureaucracy expanded in size and power owing to the state's expanded duties. Whereas in the colonial era, the smallest unit of administration had been concerned almost exclusively to collect revenue. In the postcolonial state, it sought to direct and expand production and also provide a modicum of welfare. As the table shows, during the 1940s alone, the Central Secretariat's personnel ballooned at every level. Everyone from stenographers to influential department secretaries grew in ranks. Between 1947 and 1968, employment across layers of government rose from 3 million to 9.9 million. Sarkari or government employees became the human face of the expanding Indian state. They enjoyed stable jobs and oversaw the dissemination of resources and practice of policy in an economically insecure country. These new faces of the state encountered a growing number of civilians in the professional classes, the second of these new interests. Between 1941 and 1971, India got 1 million new members of the professional classes with some form of higher education, including engineers, doctors, teachers, scientists, journalists, and lawyers. They concentrated in cities and took advantage of opportunities in a growing economy. But they could also witness and comment on the shortcomings of India's attempted political and economic transformation. The third of these growing interest groups was small and medium-sized businesses operating enterprises of less than 200 people, concentrating in the former Bombay and Madras presidencies. Smaller units were not a priority of planning, but the private sector ended up accounting for between 1/3 and 1/2 of increased manufacturing capacity and grew at 7 to 8% annually between 1950 and 1965. That's during the first 3 5-year plans. Both the new urban professionals and the commercial groups broadly began to feel the pinch of the state and the power of the bureaucrat. That might be through rising prices brought on by deficit financing of the 5-year plans, as the professionals experienced. Or it might be through a rising tax burden, which the businessmen of Bombay never missed an opportunity to lament. And you can look at the back issues of the pamphlets of the Forum of Free Enterprise if you want to know about what I'm talking about. Frustration with these aspects of everyday life came to feature in daily conversations, in debates, in associations, and the pages of newspapers and magazines. So I would recommend you to, it's not very interesting reading, but to give an example, there's The Most Highest Tax Nation by Nani Palkiwala, the lawyer who was involved in many famous Supreme Court cases, to give you a sense of this. He also used to give annual speeches at the Brabant Stadium on the annual budget, in which he generally gave focused tirades on taxation in India. It was in this environment that Ranchhordas Lotwala built his Libertarian Social Institute. The Institute published a biweekly journal called the Free Economic Review, which was later renamed the Indian Libertarian. It maintained a press, a bookshop or cooperative book house that you see pictured there, a research institute, and a residential hostel for about 45 people. The shelves of the bookshop, as you can see, are holding books that are very different from the ones that they used to hold. But you do have a sample title of a book that was written by an anti-communist associate of Lotwala, who actually features in Ram Guha's latest book, who was originally came to take part in communism in India, but then became a kind of well-known anti-communist and edited the Mice India magazine. So the Institute also sponsored essay competitions and weekly discussions. It ran a library that contained approximately 6,000 books and received over 300 visitors a day. For Lotwala, libertarianism stood for limited government and prized individual liberty. One Institute editorial defined free economy as follows. Free economy is an economy which is free from monopoly, privilege, and control of the state in various forms, as for instance, monopoly of exchange, credit, quotas, licenses, etc., in land, money, and trade. We run counter to the present-day fashionable slogans of socialism, communism, and planned economy. This was a clear response to increases in commercial regulation and plans for the nationalization of industries being pursued in India at the time. Businesses now had to secure permits to operate and obtain licenses for foreign exchange. But at the same time, Lodwala took pains to highlight that free economy was, quote, an economic order which allows no monopoly of economic power to any class, where each individual could develop his own talents and personality, unquote. It was not, in fact, laissez-faire, which he referred to as, quote, the sovereignty of capital in the business class, unquote. Under free economy, production was decentralized and would take place via cooperatives. But Lodwala offered little elaboration. And it is precisely this vagueness that allowed free economy to bring together diverse visions of alternate economic policy in a sort of pithy key word. Oops. Free economy was shaped by interlocutors of the Libertarian Social Institute across India and from the US and Western Europe. Many were lapsed internationalists, left libertarians, and anarchists. They had been pushed rightwards since the expulsion of Trotsky from the Soviet Union and the subsequent purges by Stalin of his rivals from the communist parties. The Libertarian Social Institute stood at the center of a connected cluster of English-speaking periodicals and associations scattered across urban India. We can see from letters to the magazine's editors that they reached minor cities and small towns. The chart in the slide gives circulation figures for these periodicals that help us understand how free economy spread. While less than comparable magazines of the left, which are indicated with asterisks, these figures are not inconsiderable. They point to more ideologically dense, lower circulating magazines indicated in red, and higher circulating magazines indicated in gray with the gray background. The members of this cluster did much to help each other. They offered bundled subscriptions, advertised for each other's publications, and opened local branches for each other's organizations. Together, they were more than the sum of their parts. And so this was a kind of collective action from the margins. The Indian interlocutors of the libertarians were not purely interested in questions of political economy. The founders of many of these groups had been involved in various kinds of anti-colonial struggles. Although they respected each other, major disagreements sprung up at times. So, for example, the Indian libertarians found the Hindu nationalist editors of the Organizer magazine to be too attracted to caste Hinduism and superstitious, while ignoring the allegedly rational concerns of political economy. There was also a debate with the radical humanists run by MN and Ellen Roy about whether or not the nation state was a useful unit of political organization. Libertarians said yes, the internationalist radical humanists said no. But what united these organizations was their anti-communism and aversion to the Congress Party. Right? Articles pointed to examples overseas to raise alarm that India was tending towards authoritarianism, giving it a little more kind of exaggerated polemical thrust. Right? Voluntary associations like the Libertarian Social Institute and the Forum of Free Enterprise had been the key vehicles of politics before mass nationalism. Right? They were repurposed in the post-colony. For the anti-colonial figures of different stripes who came together in this cluster, anti-statism was just as important as anti-imperialism had been in the earlier decades. And so in the changed political context, they returned to this associational politics. Morphologically, the voluntary association was the classic unit of conservative politics as articulated by Edmund Burke, providing the necessary buffer between the individual and the state. But there was also a conservative intellectual disposition uniting these groups against state expansion and centralization. Overseas, the key intellectual movement for the libertarians was American anarchist individualism associated with the critique of the New Deal and urban industrial life. We can talk more about that if you have questions. But others provided material support by allowing the Indian libertarians the rights to publish Indian editions of their works and to syndicate magazine articles. They helped by sending discounted materials and free literature in an era of scarce foreign exchange. Organizationally, the key institution in this regard was the Foundation for Economic Education in Irving upon Hudson, New York, America's major libertarian think tank and popularizer. In several ways, the Foundation's educational mission was also a model for the Indian libertarians. But I should say, and I got a question about this before, I'm not trying to suggest that this is a derivative discourse of the West, and I'll try to make that even clearer later on. The emergence and early spread of free economy challenges our understanding of non-aligned India as insulated from the Cold War battle of ideas. It shows that the Indian organizations not part of official superpower efforts, and most of these organizations did not have an active CIA connection, with the exception of Thought, which was funded in part by the what was it called, that group, the Congress for Cultural Freedom. So otherwise, these are people on their own trip, so to speak. These folks took consciously aligned positions and used global events to interpret national politics, cultivating their own interlocutors. This shows India to be a part of the transnational history of anti-communism, and the contact with free market ideas occurred in this context. It wasn't so much of Keynesianism versus free market, it's more what are varying kinds of ideas you can bring together to string together an anti-communist platform. Okay. Bilingual intermediaries developed and disseminated their ideas between the elite English-speaking public and more populous regional language publics. They helped spread free economy beyond its English language origins, which would have been intelligible to just about 5% of the population of India at that time. These intermediaries strung together new and unlikely alliances. I believe Vignesh is working in part on the 1967 elections in Madras, so later named Tamil Nadu. So that's one of the more unlikely of these alliances, what his research talks about. So in this respect, the most important figure was C. Rajagopalachari, the former right-hand man of Mahatma Gandhi, so once described as his conscience keeper, and now a bitter opponent of the progressively minded Congress under Nehru. Retired by the 1950s, he kept himself rather busy from the southern city of Madras and regularly wrote in the weekly Swarajya or Self-Rule magazine, which enjoyed a circulation of about 16,000 compared to the Indian Libertarians' 643. Rajagopalachari had been shaped profoundly by the slow commercialization of Mufassal India and its associated dislocations. Since his early life, he worried over the risk of the abuse of power by the state's personnel and influence peddling to win elections by hook or crook. So in the book, I've kind of gone into how during the interwar period in his essays about prohibition and the abolition of untouchability, he also offers these sort of latent observations about political economy and concerns about the problems with abuse of power in the state. So according to Rajagopalachari, India was a permit license quota Raj. This was an oligarchic coalition of large commercial interests, Congress party politicians, and bureaucrats who distributed permits and licenses to enforce quotas. The logic ran that business donated to the coffers of the Congress, who then instructed their bureaucrats to give them favorable treatment, and then the people suffered. But while the old British Raj had gone, Rajagopalachari suggested rhetorically that the new Raj of the Congress had come to stay. Only a conservative party could create balance for Indian democracy by offering hope of a two-party system, he argued. Rajagopalachari started to call for free economy as the platform for such a new party, and he was an avid reader of the Indian Libertarian, and he co-founded the Swatantra and Freedom Party in 1959. So Swarajya's Tamil language sister publication, Kalki, which had a circulation of about 100,000 to Swarajya 16,000, conveyed the discourse of free economy by commenting on local and regional rather than national economic affairs and deploying agrarian imagery. So you can see that in this cartoon where the finance minister, C.D. Deshmukh, is portrayed as a farmer chasing away the deficit, which is a goat that is trying to eat the sapling, called the second five-year plan. So the target audience for this literature, both Swarajya and Kalki, and so would have been the sections of Indian society growing increasingly literate and educated during this period. So between 1955 and 1960, when publications like these, came into being and started to flourish, periodical circulation in the aggregate in India rose from 11 million to 19 million. It's quite substantial. Magazines like Kalki penetrated deep into the Mofassal. Free economy became a keyword associated with projects in southern and western India. Bordered by the Arabian Sea and Bay of Bengal, these regions enjoyed long traditions of overseas trade. And in colonial times, they were governed by the Rayatwari land tenure system. Under this system, revenue was collected directly from landowning peasants without the use of intermediaries at a lower rate than under other tenurial regimes. Now, of course, and as the work of Niladri Bhattacharya and others have shown, tenurial regimes were often more of an ideal than a reality, and they masked considerable heterogeneity. But it's significant to note that constituencies from these regions would invoke this history in the post-colonial period and identify as self-employed owner cultivators to protest land reform. So let's now move from urban India to the fertile Charotar tract of the Gujarat region in Western India and consider a concrete kind of decentralist project of free economy. Our destination is the town of Anand and the adjacent Vallabh-Vidyanagar. They're both experiments in private cooperative economy with the village as the basic unit of economic organization. During the 1950s, Anand developed a center for milk production, well known. Vallabh-Vidyanagar, or town of knowledge, became the home of various educational institutions focused on science, technology, engineering, and not mathematics, but commerce. The two towns bucked a broader trend of urbanization between 1950 and 1970, when about 47 million Indians moved into the cities. The region's dominant Patidar caste reconciled local social identity and regional geography with foreign ideas and expertise to implement a rural modern vision of free economy. Whereas the dominant vision of agrarian cooperatives in India at the time was about common ownership of the means of production to dissolve inequality across castes, this cooperative form entrenched the dominance of the landowning Patidars. It transformed them into powerful regional capitalists. The success of this endeavor relied on leveraging in-group networks, small-town activity, private philanthropy, and state-facilitated access to resources. As free market ideas and neoliberal ideas traveled outside the West, they found surprising areas of contact and engagement. It would not have been anybody's guess that people like Milton Friedman would find their most enthusiastic reception at a regional university in Gujarat. Nevertheless, these Indian interlocutors engaged and incorporated only that which was useful for them. For example, the Charotar Patidars continued to privilege family and caste over individualism. They derived and formulated their ideas in an agrarian or agro-industrial context rather than for an industrial society. On the eve of independence in 1947, Anand's Patidar farmers united to throw out the British company that had paid them below wholesale prices for their milk, Polson and Company, and had brought it subsequently to market in Bombay. They organized themselves in two levels of cooperatives, individual village cooperatives to supply the milk, and the Anand Milk Union Limited, or AMUL, which would process and bring the milk to market. AMUL's Patidars overcame teething challenges to expand their scale and scope of production with the help of foreign ideas and expertise. After studying successful milk cooperatives in New Zealand, AMUL diversified away from milk into milk products. It started to dry milk into powder, extending its shelf life. It also hired an American-educated engineer from outside the community to oversee operations, Verghese Kurian, who was also the nephew of India's, I guess, second finance minister, John Matai, who resigned from his post when Nehru created the planning commissions. That's an interesting bit of trivia. Over the 1950s, Amul increased production by a factor of 27, and its membership to 33,000 farmers across 137 cooperatives. Thus, the Patidars retained local control, but incorporated necessary know-how from abroad to direct their own transition to agro-industry. The mural that you see on the slide tells part of that story. It is an instance of what Sharad Chari, the geographer, has called the mobilization of fraternal capital, whereby in-group caste ties and identification with a shared caste form the basis for a turn to industry. Vallabh Vidyanagar, pictured in this map, educated in the Anand's populace. Founded in 1947, it was intended to help reverse brain drain and keep Charotar Patidars close to home. Its creation is detailed in co-founder Bailal Bai or Baikaka Patel's Gujarati memoirs, Baikaka Naam Sansmarano. The 500-odd page book provides a rich perspective, inaccessible in English or in the formal archive, into how a local notable conceived of and implemented an economic vision. Baikaka was a career engineer who was inspired to pursue such an endeavor by his guru, India's first home minister and fellow Charotar Patidar, Sardar Patel. According to the memoirs, the project relied on Prabuddha Swartha, or enlightened self-interest. Baikaka created a private cooperative trust to coordinate the project. The trust secured the land grants from 500 Patidars to the area christened Vallabh Vidyanagar in exchange for half of their land back after the development of the area. Appealing to community interest as self-interest, the trust further secured charitable donations from Charotar Patidars across the country and in the diaspora. An industrial cooperative was created to build the physical edifices and infrastructure of the town. By the mid-1950s, a number of educational institutions sprung up, all clustered together at the center of Vallabh Vidyanagar. These included the schools of commerce, engineering, and science that you see marked on the previous slide, and the commerce and School of Commerce and High School that you see here. Reflecting the area's specialization, flagship institutions were also created to deal with the specific concerns of rural management and agricultural science. But notwithstanding the rhetoric of self-reliance and the praise of private activity, the project also relied on the day labor of non-unionized lower caste workers. Government approvals for land acquisition and construction came more quickly thanks to the Home Minister. And in his memoirs, Baikaka Patel notes with joy about how when unions had come to Vallabh Vidyanagar, the workers never joined them. So there's the unfreedom in free economy. So Vallabh Vidyanagar's flagship university called Sardar Patel University also became interested in anarchist individualism and free market thought. The individualist Ralph Borsodi from New York, who had inspired Ranchod Das Lotwala, worked there as a consultant for several months during the 1960s and designed the general educational curriculum. It's called The Education of the Whole Man. It's a very long book that is very difficult to understand, but it did serve the basis, at least de jure, for this general education program. The head of the economics department at the university, R.K. Amin, was a member of the free market Hayek and Friedman's Mont Pelerin Society, and even spent some time in the 60s visiting the University of Chicago. Milton Friedman himself, along with his wife Rose, visited Anand and Vallabh Vidyanagar in 1962, and they mentioned in their joint memoirs that this was a, quote, high spot in their trip to India. Economic concerns also center stage in the politics of the Charotar Patidars. During the 1920s, this community had staged some of the first major anti-tax protests against the Raj that inaugurated the era of mass nationalism under Gandhi, with Sardar Patel at the helm. By the late 1950s, they had repurposed their politics around two issues. The first was the perceived urban bias of resource distribution by the government. In his memoirs, Baikaka complained of the poorer quality of food rations and inadequate infrastructure spending on the village. Next, they opposed attempts to impose land ceilings on formerly Rayatwari holdings and redistribute land to tenants. Baikaka noted with anger in his memoirs that, quote, like the blind and the lame, landowners and tenants were working happily by cooperating with each other. The Congress rulers made them fight by separating them, and both now understand the dire consequences. Before they knew it, Gujarat was devastated. The memoirs are full of hyperbole with lines like this. Make for interesting reading. He quit his job as chairman of the trust in charge of Vallabh Vidyanagar to found the Gujarat Swatantra Party, and Baikaka would go on to become leader of the opposition in the state assembly. One of the MPs from Swatantra Party from Gujarat was R.K. Amin, head of the economics department. So let's now move from the quiet environs of Vallabh Vidyanagar and Anand to the bustling election rallies of India's streets. I suppose I should have had a more lively photo for you on that slide than what we have. But anyway, unlike organizations such as the Foundation for Economic Education in the Western context, the progenitors of free economy could not count purely on magazines to spread ideas. After all, most Indians at the time could not read. So the Swatantra Party brought free economy to the forefront of its electoral politics. This meant disseminating pamphlets and posters filled with epigrammatic visuals. It meant marching on the streets and chanting slogans. The way of rejecting what Thomas Blum Hansen has called one of the anti-politics of the Nehruvian state, which is to create a sort of stylized, rationalist, technocratic kind of project of development, sort of anodyne, given to you by the state, etc. So, although Swatantra's leadership did not see democracy as a means to popular emancipation, I would argue that the project is still democratic, and that often there's a lot of conflations that are made of that term that lead to its misuse. To Swatantra's leaders, democracy was a form of government that ought to bring stability, ensured by a target, and at this time imaginary, middle-class constituency, and an opposition that checked the power of the dominant party. Free economy was never a mass ideology, but Swatantra still went further than most political projects. It helped a group of Indians negotiate their enfranchisement by modifying their idioms and practices of mobilization. Long after the party's eclipse, the issues around which it rallied, inflation, taxation, and corruption, would provide enduring basis for discontent expressed in electoral politics. Pedagogy and communication were central to Swatantra's mission. So Rajgopalachari wrote the following to his colleagues in 1967. Ours is a mission to spread political and economic education, and we must firmly and devotedly stick to that work. If office comes, let us not shirk our responsibility, but that is not our aim. What we aim at is to save our country from economic collapse and bankruptcy. Swatantra's leaders did not harbor any delusions that they would defend or defeat the mighty Congress. That would have been slightly naive, but they did take seriously their pedagogical role during a difficult period in the country's economic history. By the 1960s, India faced food and foreign exchange shortages that put the brakes on planning. In 1966, the country went on a 3-year planned holiday. As you can see on the chart, inflation was ticking upwards. To help its finances, the government increased regressive indirect taxes. Swatantra sought to convey the ambitious second 5-year plan of 1956 to 61 was the culprit for its neglect of agricultural investment and deficit financing. It exaggerated India's economic woes to assault the Congress's legitimacy. The party's communication efforts included both pedagogy and polemic. In the slide, you can see a page from the party's pamphlet called Who's to Hold That Price Line? After defining inflation, it offers 3 definitions of money: a medium of exchange, a store of value, a unit of measure. Thus far, it's indistinguishable from a textbook. But now comes the polemical turn. The pamphlet introduces both an expanding number of state bureaucrats who drive up government expenditure and rising indirect taxes as causes of inflation in India. As you can see here, there's a visual contrast between the rather large, expanding government bureaucrat and the skinny, chained-up common man suffocating under taxation. Materials like this show what Charles Press has called in his seminal work on the political cartoon, a, quote, cherished community under attack. The translation of free economy into electoral politics often involved more criticism like this rather than constructive thought. The visual literature like this was also presented in Indian languages. The image on the slide is from a poster used in Madhya Pradesh called Yojana or Pragati Ki Raah Par, on the path to planning and progress. It shows a Bade Vyapari or big trader on a donkey called Congress flaring the word Samajwad or socialism from its nostril as it tramples over farmers, small traders, workers, and Madhyam Varg Janta or middle class people. So this is a indictment of life in the permit license Kota Raj, and it says at the end, it says permit license Kota Raj, Khatam Karen. So the target of this material was an ambiguously defined so-called middle-class citizen. Right? Imprecise definitions in party memoranda range from a salaried employee with a family to those who self-identified as middle class, to a self-employed person, whether a farmer, artisan, shopkeeper, or professional. It did not map onto any real major constituency in a country divided by language, caste, and region. Rather, it was an attempt to get people to identify with this ideal type. Throughout the 1960s, Swatantra did try to reach out beyond this target group, claiming in its mobilization attempts to be India's economic caretakers. The most substantial of these were Anti-Inflation Day and Anti-Excess Taxation Days. These were novel in Indian politics because Swatantra pursued them and associated activities as opportunities to disseminate an almost exclusively economic ideology. But as we know, demonstrations against price rises were nothing new. On Anti-Inflation Day in 1960, protesters wended their way across cities and towns nationwide. In the city of Pune, they burned an effigy of inflation and signed a petition seeking the president's intervention to reduce prices. In Madras, pedestrians carried signs that read, "Don't be extravagant by spending others' money, and don't ruin the country by printing notes." In Bombay, the party general secretary read passages from the free market Mont Pelerin Society pamphlet on inflation to an English language audience. Similar activities took place on Anti-Excess Taxation Day. The slide pictures various material that was distributed across the country as part of this event. Some indication of how people understood what Swatantra was trying to do and of their own political economic consciousness is given from the thousands of correspondences and petitions received by party leaders, which are preserved as barely legible uncatalogued microfilm rolls in the papers of Sri Rajgopalachari and also of K. M. Munshi. On the slide, you can see a page of a Tamil letter from a village widow to Rajgopalachari. In it, she describes how the government had not made good on the loan that it had sanctioned her to build a tube well and a surrounding wall on her property. She therefore had to abandon construction halfway. And now she was being hounded for sequestering scarce resources of water by villagers who had grazing rights in the surrounding land. They had reported her to the local revenue official and the police. The widow thus asked Rajgopalachari, in his capacity as an opposition leader, to publicize this issue and alert the people that they could not trust the government. In appeals like this, citizens invoke the opposition party as a kind of ombudsperson in their economic claim-making. Some, like the widow, wrote on behalf of themselves or family and friends asking for help resolving issues. One of them I found was about the seizure of a Philips transistor. Others wrote on behalf of groups. The examples include an income tax sufferers association. I guess we're all income tax sufferers. A Rayatwadi landowner association and an anti-corruption league. What was noteworthy in the appeals is the invocation of opposition to publicize and help address claims, and the use of a language of anti-incumbency. Economic insecurity and observations about the abuse of public office provoke discontent with the country's development strategy and could engender some sympathy for Swatantra. To slightly modify the French historian Philip Nord's term, this was a politics of economic resentment. Other categories of letters offered support for the party, proffered lengthy, sometimes running into 15, 20 pages, opinions on politics and economic affairs, or they reported on local party activities. To the extent one can discern from surnames, correspondence hailed exclusively from scholarly landed agrarian or trading castes. Swatantra's message, perhaps not so surprisingly, seemed to have registered especially well with those whose interests that it represented. But the material indicates that a small critical mass of Indians was conscious of Swatantra as opposition and found it to be a salient part of political life. To others, the party mattered less or not at all. Free economy was ultimately circumscribed in its imaginary. Swatantra sought to introduce an all-India class politics that avoided issues of gender, religion, and caste. Party leaders did not believe in special appeals based on the recognition of difference, and several had participated in the Constituent Assembly who had been for an uniform civil code and this sort of thing. For example, the middle-class citizen was always a man. Appeals to women, more than 40% of the electorate, were in their capacities as food preparers and providers who earned no income. This is true even in the appeals that are made by women officials. So Swatantra's female elected officials hailed from extremely elite backgrounds. The most famous is, of course, Maharani Gayatri Devi. Most of them had prominent husbands, and a particularly devastating line in Maharani Gayatri Devi's autobiography talks about how the victory was ultimately her husband's victory. So that's very sad. Anyway, few of their leaders hailed from lower caste or minority origins, and those who did enjoyed great wealth. So, to conclude, the Swatantra Party enjoyed its most major success in the 1967 elections, when it won 44 seats in the Lok Sabha. But of course, it's more than 500-seat Lok Sabha, so this is not earth-shattering. But the party used parliamentary debate and procedure to increase the accountability of the ruling party and make the legislature more than a rubber stamping institution. It made use of regional credentials to insert itself into contests and sought to pit the opposition party of the region against the Congress at the center through mergers, coalitions, and alliances of non-competition. Now, this is not a party history, but I do discuss this a little bit in the book, and we can talk about it more. The 1967 elections were a major setback if we read the work of Francine Frankel and others, and Congress lost power in several states. Swatantra formed the key opposition the official opposition in Gujarat, Rajasthan, and Andhra. And finally, Swatantra mobilized citizens and appealed to the judiciary against perceived legislative overreach by the majority to defend the right to property, inserting itself into key Supreme Court cases of the period on bank nationalization, which law students continue to read about R.C. Cooper versus Union of India, and the abolition of privy purses. And the lawyer in both cases was the anti-tax Nani Palkhiwala, who was not a formal member of the Swatantra Party, but in both of those cases, there were sort of Swatantra people named on the case, and he was very much in several of the Bombay Party meetings and whatnot. So, a few years after its greatest success, Rajgopalachari died, and a split in the Congress led many of Swatantra's leaders to join one of that party's two factions, primarily the Congress O, right? But Swatantra's significance was never electoral or entirely of the past. Right? And so one of the things that I've tried to think about in this book is moving beyond the electoral history. What can we say? Or even the fact that the vote banks come primarily from the princely states, former zamindars, etc. The key communities who got beyond Swatantra ideologically, and I don't mean in terms of vote banks, today wield disproportionate influence over the economy relative to their size. And many of them are, in the book by Harish Damodaran called India's New Capitals, right? Patidars, Kammas, Tamil Brahmins. I don't know if he has Gaundars in there, but Sarachari has done a good job of that. So some of these communities shift their political allegiances as convenient. Others have left to countries like the United States to seek out their economic fortunes. I'm thinking particularly of Kammas and Reddys, Tamil Brahmins, Patidars all over New Jersey, Hindus for Trump. And still others support the newly dominant BJP, right? So according to the BJP, yes, I probably don't need to say this to this audience, Hindus are a superior race and the Muslim minority of 200 million people are internal enemies. And so acknowledging the major presence of conservative constituencies in Indian societies, we have liberal upper caste public intellectuals like Amartya Sen and Ram Guha. On the one hand, you have journalists and frustrated business people who have called for a revival of the Swatantra Party as, a non-sectarian Swatantra Party as an alternative. We can kind of talk about that. We've also got self-identifiedly like free market think tanks like the Center for Civil Society that organized this conference in 2018. and turned over the papers of the Swatantra party to Nehru Library. And then there are, of course, those who are disingenuously appropriating the history of Swatantra for their purposes, like the hashtag Swarajya magazine that considers itself a 65-year-old startup, and it has used the language of free markets and whatnot, but also is essentially a thinly veiled way of defending the regime in power and giving it some kind of stressing that it has some kind of affinity to the mission and truth of Swatantra. Also conveniently forgetting the very spirited attacks that Rajgopalachari leveled at the editor of the organizer, K.R. Malkani, asking him to stop publishing anti-Muslim cartoons and editorials in the organizer. So as calls for Swatantra's revival are made as an alternative to the ethno-nationalist BJP, its history illuminates both the possibilities and challenges. And so with that, that's all, folks. So thank you very much for listening, and I really look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Aditya. I suggest we maybe take a seat. Now, so it was a hugely rich talk, and I'm really looking forward to properly reading the book. I've only very skimmed a little of it so far. But I just wanted to kick us off with a few thoughts or kind of questions, and then open up to colleagues as well. I find that the Swatantra phenomenon fascinating, because I think it really draws attention to the peculiarity of the Indian party system in many ways, that it hasn't consolidated into a party system defined by an ideology of left and right. And of course, what you show us here is that the ideology of economic conservatism that has circulated in India from the 1950s is a rather different kind of economic conservatism than the kind of left-right politics of advanced industrial democracies in Western Europe of the time. So I was struck as I was listening that there are kind of forerunners of the kind of way that Pradeep Chibra and Rahul Verma in their book on ideology and party system define the contours of ideological conflict in what you say. I thought actually there was more consistency with the kind of argument that they present there than, well, I was struck by that, which was really to say that one strain of ideological thinking is this anti-statist strain, which has continued to be persistent, and they suggest can be mapped onto contemporary party system. I might depart from them there, but I think if there's a kind of question in all of this, it's to push you on the puzzle of why Swatantra didn't, why it kind of fizzled out when it did, and why, how the political economy of planning and its implications for the shape of labour and capital really precluded the consolidation of this kind of party system shaped along ideological lines, or kind of along a kind of class conflict or labour capital conflicts. So the kinds of constraints that led to the kind of philosophy of espoused by Swatantra. The second question was the kind of transnational domestic question. So you say that you've asked before whether you were describing free economy as a derivative discourse. And I just wanted to push you a little further on that, really, because you highlight throughout the significance of anti-communist thought or the Cold War context for offering kind of frames of reference, I suppose, if I'm not kind of mis-summarizing there, for Swatantra, but clearly, actually, in the domestic pamphleteering and political sloganeering, the focus is much more on an anti-socialist, anti-statist kind of politics, which is, critique of Indian planning. And at least in what you presented today, I didn't see a clear focus on, communist parties and the communist influence in India. So I was just wanted to understand a little better how you see the transnational and domestic streams shaping each other. And the third question, if I may, was on the kind of decentralism, decentralist project. I just was intrigued by your framing of Anand as a decentralist project, but I didn't quite follow whether you were suggesting that there was a kind of ideological commitment to decentralization that Swatantra were also promoting. So if you could just say a little more on that as well.
Yeah, sure. So I guess I'll take them in the reverse order, if that's all right. So I think when I use the sort of terminology of decentralized, it was more that rather than a sort of national enterprise public sector that is part of a sort of broader national level vision, so something that's being of course, later it expands across the country. It becomes the model for the National Dairy Development Board, et cetera, et cetera. But with starting in a sort of local context, it's starting in a particular region, run by its own kind of entrepreneurs. And so that was an idea that regional economy rather than national economy. So that's the kind of framing, and that is the unit of sort of accumulation. And the idea, so there's not so insofar as decentralization is taken up, it's not a sort of one of the sort of demands of the party that we want a decentralized development it should be in the way that they talk about price stability, for example. But what you can sort of see from the articulations is that this is kind of where they're coming from when they're concerned about the arm of the big state at the center. And that kind of leads me to the second response, which is about anti-communism versus anti-socialism, right? And so I think from the literature on the West and anti-communism, there, one of the things that one sees people make is a sort of road to serfdom kind of argument, that the moment that you nationalize one enterprise and it's only a question of time before, we're all in Stalin's hell, right? And so I think that is the register in which they're going for. And so it's anti-communist in that particular sense. And that also shows you why there are people who have different kind of sets of ideas about political economy, but they're able to kind of come together. But it's also worth noting that this party isn't that concerned about the Communist Party, right? Because they believe that the communists are a pretty small game in town. Of course, the Congress they find to be susceptible to the sort of party as a party of pressure to its influence. But this is also, it's a party that's founded the year that EMS Namboothiripad's government is dismissed. So it's more about what is the rhetorical value of using these kinds of arguments. Right? And it also comes from a little bit of tone deafness, if I might say, right, about the Indian context. And that leads me to an answer to your third question, right, which is why do things fizzle out? Well, I think the question that I was interested in was. Because originally this was like, it's a project about a party that failed. But someone, asked me, well, what about the fact that there was a party that was quite unlikely in the first place? You think about the odd coalition of, the reactionary elements and, the vote banks, right? And then you have people like Raj Gopalachari and Minu Masani, who I didn't talk about today, but I've written about elsewhere, who's a sort of, Bombay Parsi aristocrat, writes these English language children's books that have circulation. How do they come together? And I would say that one thing is that they do have that shared legacy of the nationalist movement together. And I would say that that kind of brings them together and sort of shared battle stripes. But I would also say that what is profoundly challenging for them, and I allude to this more in the book, is that getting the vote banks for this kind of a politics is a notoriously difficult thing to do. And it's something with a kind of pedagogical mission that's not necessarily interested in a ground up kind of politics. it's going to be very difficult to kind of broaden yourself in these ways. And so you have this, on the one hand, you have these, numerically small but influential communities that like buy into the ideology. Your Parsis in Bombay sitting in the form of free enterprise. Your votes are actually coming from like some zamindar who has, power in Rajasthan. And so once those people find Congress more attractive, that's really the death knell for these guys. And of course, Indira Gandhi in 1971, the sort of classic Tripto Kaviraj essay kind of sort of changes the equation, in terms of the language and discourse of politics, and then the Congress party system, et cetera, and Swatantra is kind of a casualty to that. But then there's also, and again, I don't talk too much about it, but there's also a kind of internal explanation of decline, which is that Minu Masani, who is the general secretary, tries to run this like a business organization. And Indian political parties don't work like a business organization. And so that becomes a very difficult thing and there's also a kind of popular disconnect. I mean, there's a wonderful letter from Rajgopalachari, who was himself never a mass politician, never won an election in his life, by the way. He says, your meetings in Bombay are no good because you put all the business donors in the front, and then, there's like standing room only for the people at the back. And so that doesn't really help with the whole perception of an elite party, right? So that's so it's more that, or at least, I think it fizzles out for various reasons, but that it ever happened is the thing that I find kind of interesting.
Thanks. Let me open to questions and comments. Yeah, Vignesh.
So thanks a lot, Aditya. I also had the good fortune to go through the book. Wow. But
I should drink some water.
Which is there's a lot of economics. About talk about economy, but where the party has actually been successful. My sense, which is there's a lot of culture as well. Swatantra's own rendition of what culture meant, and regionalization in a certain sense, which is in turn informing their economics.
Yeah.
So, for instance, Kalki that you spoke about actually has Ponniyin Selvan, which is one of the very common and widely understood ways of even perceiving history, though it's a work of fiction.
Right.
Most widely sold books, and in fact, though Kalki Krishnamurti had a treatise on nationalism, but that did not work as much. And then comes inflation plus the anti-Hindi sentiment, which then pushes Swatantra. But why was that sort of a deafness absent in other places? There was a very tall leader like N.G. Ranga in Andhra, who was, in a certain sense, professor of Annadura himself, but who taught Annadura himself. But that did not happen anywhere else. And we just spoke about Minu Masani, but why was that agility not there anywhere else?
Sure. Yeah. I think that if we look at I'm really glad that you asked that question, because part of the thing that I'm trying to do is to say that we shouldn't necessarily think of culture and economy as totally distinct, and that actually, if you go and look at a Kalki, you have a section after Sadashivam, husband of M.S. Subbulakshmi, takes over. Every week you have a section called NSAD, which is like what's news, and it actually has some fairly sharp economic commentary, right? Very sort of skeptical kind of stuff. And so you're not just getting your Ponniyin Selvan, one of the best-selling movies of 2022, and part 2 coming out in June. Yeah. And so what I think is important is that in pockets like that, right, you have these bilingual intermediaries who are deeply steeped in the culture of the region. Right? Rajgopalachari never leaves India until 1962. He grows up in a village, and the most profound observations he ever makes about political economy are from these short stories that are written in the Tiruchengood ashram. Right. Minu Masani, on the other hand, has got absolutely no connection to the common man, or at least the concerns of non-urban industrial life. Somebody once. It's a slightly racist thing, but somebody once said he's the only Indian man I ever met who used to ever show up on time to things. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that it's a way somebody who very much saw himself as a kind of internationalist, person. And similarly, Pilu Modi, I had the privilege of interviewing Howard Erdman. Pilu Modi used to basically go, they'd have a local notable give a talk in Gujarati. He would speak in English, and he brought like a portable bathroom with him to rural Gujarat when they were doing campaigning. So you have certain people who are your early, who are a little like your early colonial bourgeois elites, right? Who are, speaking the King's English, etc., but don't have a connection. And then in other areas, I think Ranga himself and the Kammas and Reddys are interesting because Ranga, even though he is, professor of economics and can, he's actually friendly with George Padmore, writes this credo of world peasantry in the 1960s. He is somebody who also has a very strong kind of local base of support, and he's considered a regional figure. So the fact is that you have this tension between people who have local constituencies of support and are able to bring together local political economy and maybe national and transnational currents of economic thought. But you also have people who are a little bit kind of tone deaf to this kind of thing and don't have that mass footprint, and which is why you also then have to bring together your zamindars and come together on something like land reform, right, or your big mirastas.
Yeah, so I think they're very interesting. I look forward to the book. I have not seen it at all, so unlike Louise and Vignesh, but I wanted to ask you, what do we know, and presumably you could tell us what you know about the relationship between Swatantra and the Hindu right?
Yeah.
I mean, one sees, you mentioned, of course, the Rajagopalachari took this position and said, stop, don't vote this anti-Muslim stuff and so on. But one of the posters that you, one of the pamphlets that you showed here at the bottom said, Dharm, Dharti, Dhan, Dhando, Ki Raksha Kare.
Right.
And Dharm was the first of those four things. Right. Ki Raksha Kare. Yeah. So there does seem to be a natural affinity, and later there was, right? I mean, by the late 60s, there was a coming together of Swatantra and Jansangh. There was an alliance, right? So how is it that the Hindu Mahasabha RSS lot did not, or was there any traffic? Were there any attempts to have a relationship? What is the sort of story that we don't know?
Yeah, so absolutely. I think that's really important. And I think, so I would kind of go chronologically through this. So look at the origins. If you look at somebody like Lodwala is an Arya Samaj kind of person that's what awakens him politically, etc. But in the 1940s, and in the 1940s, after partition, he starts to say some very like anti-Pakistan and anti-Muslim things. But as he is trying to figure out what's the most important thing taking place right now, some of that rhetoric is kind of jettisoned. And so this contact with Malkani, who writes this book, Principles for a New Political Party in 1951, where he says that, look, this is, this stuff that they're interested in, because he's also sort of caste reform kind of person. He says that these guys are really kind of missing the major, the major game in town, or the major issue. And so there is, while I think caste, plays a role in informing some of these concerns and prejudices, I think there is a feeling that there's a, that we are distinct from sort of Hindu nationalist project now. And actually, the term, and so the what's interesting in sort of reading this is how you have the sort of religious chauvinism kind of drops out by the late 1950s as you're sort of tracking free economy. And I think that's significant. Actually, it's in even before Malkani, the first usage of pseudo-secular actually comes from Lodwala's journal. So I think once you get to the Congress party, people who are taking up Swatantra, like a Rajagopalachari or a Masani, etc., they're more interested in pursuing a kind of a religion blind sort of approach. But of course, the land, it's interesting that you mentioned Dharma. Dharma is essentially used by Rajagopalachari in different ways to think about, an ideal. It's not what the caste system became, but it's what it originally, was supposed to be as a kind of division of labor, and it's also connotes a kind of idea of duty, etc. And so there's that dimension. But I would still kind of differentiate that a little bit from some sort of Hindu nationalism. When you get to somebody like K.M. Munshi, it becomes more difficult, right? Because K.M. Munshi is pretty much interested in this sort of reconstruction, demolition of mosque, reconstruction of Somnath temple, attached to Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan, etc.
Both of them. Nachagoparachari published with Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan himself.
Yes.
Translation of Mahabharata.
Yeah, Mahabharata, and yeah. So I think that, and there's an episode in the book, which comes from Devika Sethi's book about censorship, about the publication of biographies of religious leaders, controversy that takes place and leads to riots in UP. It's done with the imprint of Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan and has some offensive comments about the prophet, etc. So I would say that Rajagopalachari's relationship with the Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan is pretty much for publishing his work. I think with Munshi, it's more a part of an ideological Hindu-ness project. Actually, Munshi is there at the original meeting of the VHP in 1964, right? But insofar as I'm able to decipher, right? Munshi is not somebody who has very much, he kind of lends his name and prestige to the party, but isn't actually quite involved with threshing out the platform and this sort of thing. Where things become, and there is tension, with Rajagopalachari on some of these questions in the letters that they exchange. With respect to, and that also is, in terms of alliances with the Janasangh. So in a couple of states, I think in Bihar, they form, temporary alliances with the UP. They form some, alliances of no competition with the Janasangh. But there is always a kind of a discomfort with that. And so the idea is that, well, there are elements of Swatantra that kind of maybe can be co-opted. But I think what's significant is that despite having these elements in their party, the line is, continues to be a broadly kind of religion blind platform. Now, and I suppose that's also where the hope is that, perhaps this can be repurposed towards something that continues to be broadly secular. But I would still, there is an affinity, I would say, but I would say that it's one that is just that. It's something that you can equally point to arguments or point to examples that are of the opposite kind. And so I would say that, and if you look at on the one hand, they're also making alliances with the DMK, right? So I think there is the idea that this is an element of a sort of softer version of Hindutva, that I think is complicated. But I think to take the distinction between Hindu revivalists versus Hindu nationalists, right? I think you would say that, particularly in the North, you have dimensions of the party who subscribe to or sympathetic to those kinds of politics. But it's a significant choice that they come together with Swatantra in the 60s rather than Janasangh. In the 50s, it's different because the Janasangh is kind of, it's not really a major force in town. And also, they're still dealing with the stigma of the aftermath of Gandhi's assassination, etc.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Thank you so much. It was really insightful talk. Maybe this is a naive question, but I was quite intrigued by this quotation from Lotwara about where he sort of characterizes his position, and you say that he's envisioning production run by cooperatives that are quite decentralized.
Yeah.
And he also says that he doesn't want the hegemony of capitalism, or maybe in different words. I was just wondering then, what is right about his position?
Yeah.
And why is his anti-communism? I get his anti-socialism, especially to that strain of neoliberal socialism. But why is he so vehemently anti-communist? What happens to this?
Yeah. So I think there's sort of two answers to your question. One is a intellectual biographical answer, which is what happened in this person's life. Well, he was the great patron of socialism in Bombay, Scotland, socialism and communism in Bombay. Scotland Yard was very concerned about it. He smuggled all these leftist texts in the interwar period from London, where he had a nice house where Indians used to come and chat and plot revolution. And smuggled them back with him, etc. Fascinating stuff in the Indian political intelligence files. But what happens is after the Meerut conspiracy, his house is searched. And that's like the first time that this polite patron of everything, is radical underneath the sun. And you finally have, the scars of battle, he sort of freaks out. Right. And so it's like, oh my God, this is all, I have to, rethink the way that I'm pursuing this. And then, of course, you start getting knowledge about what's happening in the Soviet Union under Stalin. And these guys were, of course, the Trotskyists, right? They were the internationalist line, and Trotsky is then kind of submerged. And so there's this concern that we were looking for liberation and freedom, etc. But we have this, anti-liberatory, thrust to what's taking place in the USSR right now. So that's kind of one thing. Functionally, in terms of the cooperatives themselves, so very often people who are like pro-free market believe that capitalism doesn't tend towards the centralization of capital and accumulation in like big business, etc. Right? So in other words, in an ideal world, we would all produce our, in a Schumpeterian world, we'd all be like small businesses producing our nice things, etc. There would be no Amazons, right? We'd all be like nice independent booksellers and like earn our bread and whatnot. But of course, we have Amazon. So that's obviously a contradiction. But you do see, but of course, this all has to be done via private property. The person owns their own bread or whatever. It's cooperative, but it's still, it's not common ownership, or it is a dissolution that is owned by an abstract entity, right? It's like you own this part of the cooperative, you own something else, you own your little plot of land, etc. So in that sense, it is, and then there's no like compulsion by the state. So that's one thing. But of course, there is that contradiction, which is that over time, if you let this work out to its logic, you may have agglomeration, and it's just like similar. I mean, it's a parallel point about riot body. Riot body was theorized by Monroe in one way, and then yet you have these like huge Mirazdars in South India sitting around, and now they're getting together with NG Ranga and saying, oh wow, we're really just we're just really these poor landowner cultivators, and what are you doing taking away our property? So I think that there is this difference in terms of the way in which capitalism is idealized, but there's also that sort of question mark about what if we follow the logic of capital to its natural endpoint? We see something just as bad as you say that you're not interested in.
Any other questions? Comments? No. In which case, we are at 6:30. So let's thank you for today, and thank you so much. And the book comes out in September.
September in the UK, and then in India, July 18th. So
we wish you all the best
thank you so much
for the actual launch.
Thank you.
Thank you.